Welcome to Cape Town. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Right. Thank you for the one in the middle. Apologies for the late start, but ticketing. We've got a fairly busy day today, so we'll kick off with a quick introduction from Sasha to give you some background. We'll then go to our keynote. I'm hearing feedback up here to Jess, who's going to be our keynote. We're going to do a brief session on how to get the best out of a ZANOG meeting, and then Mark Tinker is going to give us a quick optics update. So, more ado, Sasha. Sasha Booth is the chairperson for ISPA and will introduce us to everything.
Thank you so much. Short chairperson, so I have to adjust this. Hi everyone, good morning and welcome. So as mentioned, I am the chairperson of ISPA and I'm also at NTT, but prior to that, I was at MWeb, so that's where I got my love for ISPs and all thing internet related. So really happy to welcome you to ISPA's iWeek with ZANOG. I know that it's long overdue. The last one was held in 2019. So I'm really looking forward to hosting everyone, and I hope that you have an amazing time. We have an exceptional program of incredible speakers, and there's a lot of fantastic networking opportunities. So I hope that this will be a valuable day for you, or a conference for you. We have quite a few days involved as well. But before we proceed, just a few house rules. Please have your devices on silent. And if you need to use the bathrooms, it's outside and upstairs. And lastly, there are no drills. So if you hear an alarm, run. I'm kidding. Don't run. Walk to the exits. There will be assistance for you. But yeah, that's short and sweet. And I hope you have a fantastic time. Now for the fun part and the keynote. Prof. Jess.
Hello again. I'm Fergus Mackay, by the way, from Flex Optics, in case you hadn't guessed by the colour. I'm one of the co-chairs, and you'll see others of us chairing during the week. Great. So Jess is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town, where she directs the MPhil in Inclusive Innovation and teaches innovation, business in Africa, ethnography, qualitative research methods, and storytelling for impact. At UCT, amongst other roles, she directs the Light Lab, an interdisciplinary research entity exploring light in knowledge infrastructure as well as metaphor and popular epistemology. Jess has received multiple awards and affiliations and is, amongst others, a P-rated future leader scholar with the South African National Research Foundation. We are so pleased to have her. Her talks are excellent. We basically watched the video and went, yes, please, we'll have her. So please, welcome Jess.
Thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. As I say, I'm Jess Albach-Jahadja, and it's a real joy and wonderful opportunity to be able to interact with all of you. You guys all know much more about the internet in certain ways than I do, but I hope to offer some slightly different perspective and provocation for the conference that follows. It's not working. Nope. Alas. I think it's funny that at a tech conference, there we go, thank you, okay. So in terms of why I'm here, I'm a social scientist. I was part of the group of people who really didn't understand the internet until during my PhD, which I completed at Stanford University in the States. I was very much immersed in the Silicon Valley tech world. And of course, it was really interesting to hear the ways in which Africa as a continent and a region was discussed and imagined in that space. And I spent 2 years living in Angola. From 2012 I started, and then 2013 and 2014 I lived there the whole time. And it was during the time that the South Atlantic cable was lit between Luanda and Brazil. And in that moment, digital life in Angola radically changed. And it landed up being a footnote in my PhD thesis, that there's something powerful going on with African digital technology. And it was a footnote that I kind of couldn't quite let go of. And so I did the things that were required of me. I published the books. I did the kind of work to prove myself as a social scientist. But I couldn't let go of the fact that there was a real disconnect in terms of how Silicon Valley was imagining the African internet and how I was experiencing it, and many of my colleagues and friends were experiencing it going forward. Okay. So this is just a silly cartoon to kind of, I guess, justify the value of having a social scientist here. So many of you spend your lives working on how to make the internet better and the kind of deep and complex challenges of how do we set up digital communication structures across the continent. But of course, for everyday users, there's something quite pragmatic about how the internet needs to function. And I kind of laugh with the experience of just how complex it can be to get slides working at a tech conference or something like that. There we go. So this is one of the very few audiences where, thank you, I'm grateful to be told to slow down. I do tend to speak quite fast, so please feel free to indicate. It won't be the first time. But at most places where I speak, I can pretty much assume that nobody in the audience understands how the internet works. So for this group, sure, you get it, right? This is kind of your primary school introduction to the internet. But for most people who I interact with, this is much more how the internet appears. If you ask your average PhD scholar in almost anything other than computer science, how does your email actually function? Most of them just go, magic. And so the illustrations that I have there, the one is from DALL-E, OpenAI's image generation software. And I asked it to draw me a picture of the internet as magic. The second one is a subreddit that I thought was quite funny about Bitcoin, of basically saying, how do digital currencies function? Well, the answer is magic. And this, I think, becomes very important because digital communications are, of course, the fundamental tool that all of us rely on for commerce, for romance, for education, for almost all aspects of our lives. And where with most other technologies, you can expect your average layperson maybe to have an understanding of how an internal combustion engine works or how a bicycle functions, whatever a gas stove actually cooks your food. When it comes to digital communication, it's astonishing how little everyday people actually know. And part of what I hope to convince you of during this talk is that this is actually a real problem when it comes to Africa. That in addition to digital literacies, which are relatively straightforward to teach, you can teach people how to use a device. But digital capabilities that help people understand, well, how is the algorithm coming up with certain results? What are the implications of connecting to Huawei versus a network owned and operated by the United States? How do we think about those as we develop digital connectivity across Africa are actually really essential questions. And it's imperative that when we work with young people, with people in your organizations, we demystify the magic that we've allowed the internet to become and make it a tool that people are fully empowered to think with in terms of the politics, as well as also the questions around usability. So if you've heard me speak before, I think a couple of people have, you would have seen this image. And I'm going to invite you to just look at it for a moment. Most of you will be a bit confused, and a few of you will very quickly see that this is an inverted map of the world. So Cape Town is exactly where Cape Town would like itself to be, right on the top of the world. That's a joke for the Cape Townians. But if you can see the southern tip of Africa at the top of the map, and then what you have is the Atlantic Ocean in black. And this was an insight that came to me in grade 5 in primary school, where we had a wonderful geography teacher. And we were learning about the so-called voyages of discovery, of course, European discovery, because there were plenty of people living here before. And this teacher pointed out that there is no such thing as up or down in space. That north was a very convenient, there's north and south, but what direction those pose doesn't actually matter. And his argument was that if we saw ourselves as South Africans at the bottom of the world and didn't realize that we might have something to contribute in terms of our voice and our perspective and our history, we would find ourselves quite limited in what we could do. And of course, in the 1500s, when map-making conventions were being developed, there were ways in which putting Europe and North America at the top of the world was politically expedient to a broader project of extraction, of missionization, and of colonization that was really going to shape the next 5 centuries. And part of what I'm talking about today is the fact that we're in a similar kind of moment with the digital, and that we on the continent of Africa and in South Africa have a unique opportunity to ensure that digital infrastructure doesn't reflect the histories and the power structures of previous centuries, but rather opens up possibilities for different kinds of imagination and economic activity. So, what is the African internet? I asked ChatGPT, or it was DALL-E as well, and this strange image that looks like 1992 word clip art was what the system spat out. And I thought that was really interesting because it captures something about the imagination that is embedded in the data sets on which these systems are trained. So what is Africa in the digital imagination? Well, is it a 1992 version of the world with a kind of basic PC and some random text? Or is it Black Panther, which was one of the most important interventions in imagination of the continent that arguably of the last 100 years? And there's kind of this polarity where we either think of Africa as this basic, disconnected, sort of underprivileged, under-resourced space, or we think of it as the futuristic space of the future. And of course, most of you must be working in the middle, in the reality of the everyday complexity of a continent that has a huge amount of resources, potential, people, innovation. I mean, if you don't innovate in many parts of this continent, you actually don't survive. Whereas in many other places in the world, innovation is this cool thing that companies get to do when they're done with their core product design. And there's something about being in this space that gives us tremendous opportunity, but we have to be aware of the geopolitical structuring of our internet landscape. So this is a book that I read recently. Some of you may be familiar with it. And for me, it points to how high the stakes are. So this is about the production of chips, and particularly it writes about NVIDIA, which I believe just hit the 3 trillion valuation mark. And it's a book that looks at how the United States and China, Japan, South Korea have been kind of struggling over control of this core industry that effectively runs the world today. If we don't have chips, our whole communication system, our whole transport system, all of it collapses. And you would all know that very, very well. But if you look through this book, the continent of Africa is almost entirely invisible. It's as if other than taking some kind of rare earth minerals from the DR Congo, beyond that, the continent doesn't feature. And it's almost as if the millions and millions of people who are creating digital futures and engaging in global markets are completely invisible. So I want to introduce some quick concepts, and forgive me if I sound a little bit too professor-like just for a couple of minutes, but hopefully these concepts will come alive as we go. So the project that I'm working on is called Capricious Connections, and it's really trying to understand how different aspects of digital infrastructure plug in or intersect with global geopolitics. And so I'm interested in how we think, how the hardware and the software and the people interact with one another to be able to create something that on certain levels is unique to the African realities, and of course is part of a much bigger dialogue around global internet futures. I'm going to talk today about, about digital colonialism. And I know sometimes people are like, we're so done with colonialism. But give me a chance with this, because what I want to do is illustrate how systems of digital infrastructure are layering themselves upon other systems of extraction that lead to interesting questions around what we in Africa do to ensure that we don't land up as the kind of raw data source of a company like Meta or Alphabet. I want to talk about surveillance capitalism, which is an idea that particularly in the United States at the moment, about how our actions and our behaviors are algorithmically predicted and how that allows certain kinds of governance structures. Again, often compared with the governance structures compelled by Chinese digital surveillance states. And in many ways, you can see that these systems are not actually that different. The Chinese model and the US model land up with the same kinds of algorithmic predictions, though one is normally in the free market and one is state created. Then I want to talk about some new work around the coded gaze. And what's meant by the coded gaze is this idea that algorithms see people differently based on where they are, where they're working, things like race, things like perceptions of religion, zip code, all kinds of different indicators that become part of your digital tag. And then with that, I'm going to talk about the urgency of developing digital capabilities and kind of demystifying the magic of the internet that we have all enabled. So I just want to say this work builds on the work of many, many different people. There's a real push at the moment towards a kind of critical digital scholarship. So just trying to understand how the systems that you all build and maintain are increasingly shaping pretty much every aspect of all of our lives. So I'll speak to some of these texts, but there's of course a huge amount that can be done to change the way the internet is thought of. And here I'll just share one story. You can see the book Digital Democracy, Analog Politics. And it's written by a friend of mine, Nanjala Nyabola from Kenya. And we were in the same class together when we did our master's degrees at Oxford. And Nanjala wanted to write about Twitter in the Kenyan elections in 2008. And if you're familiar with Cambridge Analytica, the 2008 Kenyan election was where a lot of the software and structures that were used in the US election later on were tested. And so the 2008 elections were a critical moment in terms of algorithmic interference with democracy. And Nanjala went to the professor at Oxford and said, this is my topic. And he said to her, absolutely not. You don't write about Africans using Twitter. That's an inappropriate topic. You can look at kinship, you can look at culture, you can look at politics, but the idea of Africans doing sophisticated things on the internet is not one that we can entertain. And Nanjala was really mad and said, right then, over beers or something, I'm going to write a book that they have to teach, which they now do. But the point is that there's been a long shift of African scholars trying to make African digital realities visible, whilst also ensuring that the work that is being done at a technical level really has an impact and is able to bring people online. Okay. So I invert all of my maps, forgive me, this is a point that I make in terms of a sort of speaking to certain power structures, because I do think it helps when you see the world differently. And there's something about how we perceive our place in the planet that is reinforced again and again and again by the structures of imagination that literally code the way that we all think. So I use telegeography's map a great deal, submarine cables. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And this is the cable map that I first became fascinated with when I looked at the lighting of the first trans-South Atlantic fiber optic cable in 2012. And I would encourage you to play with that map. And part of what you see, you can click on each of the links, each of the lines, and you can see who owns the cable, where does it run through, where are its landing points. And what I find fascinating is that increasingly these cables are themselves geopolitical indicators. So there's a cable called Peace, which runs from China across North Africa. There's Equiano, which has just landed here. Equiano is named after a Haitian slave revolution leader. A lot of these cables carry all kinds of cultural coding in their names, and they make geopolitical statements that are determined by the consortia of companies that run them. And so companies like Seacom might not be putting their name on the cable specifically, but you can guarantee that the thought process behind naming digital infrastructure is one that is often highly politically salient, if not for the companies themselves, then certainly for the messaging that comes when a cable is switched on and when users start interacting with this infrastructure, which is increasingly becoming quite well known. So to make things simple, this is the book project that I'm currently working on. So I've got 3 months away from my day job of teaching to work on this book over the next 3 months until the end of June. And what I'm trying to do is to untangle the thread of digital complexity by telling the story of effectively 3 cable systems. So an older one, a newer one, and one that is kind of in the middle. And using this thread as a way to illustrate to the public, well, how does the internet work? What questions should we be asking of it? And where are the examples of African innovation which we can tell? And of course, I would imagine that I could easily write about almost any of your companies and the work that each of you are doing. Come on, let's try that. There we go. But for the sake of this story, I'm focusing on 6 particular entities. So the one is Rosalind Thomas's SAEX, which is a new cable system that will hopefully begin operation in the next 4 or 5 years, running from Singapore through to North America around the coast of Africa. And I spoke to Roz yesterday, and she said, please tell them all that this is a good route that avoids the Middle East and the Red Sea. So, there's a real, you can see, anyone who's been reading digital news will know the impact of these 3 cables that were cut in the Red Sea the last couple of weeks, and how closely connected digital infrastructure is to contemporary geopolitics. I'm looking at Mauritius Telecom because Mauritius is tiny, and it's a really great example of a company that 25 years ago saw how digital communications were changing and invested very heavily both in satellite but also in undersea cables. I'm looking at Tenet as an example of a network that runs, it's an education network in South Africa, but how does one system operate in the context of certain national legislation and the imperative to get more people online? Then Murtec Marine, I'm not sure if there's anyone from Murtec at the conference, but they're an incredible company that started because some wealthy guy in Stellenbosch accidentally bought a piece of retired fiber optic cable. Sorry, it wasn't fiber optic, it was the precursor. A retired piece of digital communications cable at auction, and then decided, well, what am I going to do with this thing? And he set up this company that is now, we'll get to snow crash in a minute. He set up a company that is now the world leader in sustainability and fiber optic recycling. And they're based in Gqeberha. And many people have never even heard of this company. But in terms of global innovation, South Africa is really leading the charge around how do we develop sustainable and environmentally sound digital ecosystems. Then I'm looking at Angola Cables, and I interviewed the CEO recently, who told me that they're going to have to rebrand because they are finding that to be associated with Africa as a global digital company in terms of having the name Angola in their title is becoming quite complex because globally people don't want to interact with an Africa company in the same way as they might something else. So they'll rebrand the company and continue doing the excellent work that they are already doing. But it's really interesting how the association and the assumptions around Africa shape digital futures in terms of how companies are interacted with and what kind of trade deals become possible or not. And then finally, I've been spending quite a lot of time on the Leon Thevenin, which is a ship that if you haven't heard of, is the thing that makes your jobs possible. And that the Leon Thevenin is Africa's sole dedicated fiber optic cable repair vessel. It's staffed by the most amazing 60 men. They are all men. And the work that they do in terms of hauling up the cables from the deep sea and the technical work of fixing and of repairing and maintaining the backbone structures that we all rely on is quite remarkable. And so part of the story that I'll be telling is very much around the cook and the person who kind of sweeps the vessel to keep it going. all this incredible labor that goes into maintaining digital infrastructure, which many of us don't see and don't think about. But to get to seeing and thinking, I want to think of how Africa, and again, returning to this idea of imagination, how do we think about the continent? So I'm not sure how many of you have read either of these two books. The one is Heart of Darkness, which was written in the 1800s by Joseph Conrad, and is a kind of archetypal book around justifying colonialism. So it's a story of a vessel that goes through the Congo River, and it finds people who are represented as uncivilized and savage, and it kind of justifies the need for colonial expansion. And the second is Snow Crash, which was written, has anyone read it? Okay, I thought there'd be a few. So Snow Crash is kind of one of these sort of fundamental sci-fi texts which have certainly shaped the ways in which Silicon Valley imagines the metaverse. So the metaverse was kind of prototyped in this particular novel. And what I found really interesting when I read Snow Crash, having attended so many parties in Silicon Valley where all these sort of tech bros were talking about Snow Crash, is that apartheid South Africa figures in really interesting ways. So part of the model of Snow Crash, it exists in this futuristic world where the metaverse has kind of become our dominant reality. And human beings live in something called burbclaves, which are modeled on the apartheid homelands policy. And that version of a kind of separate internet where people are rather than being fully connected in the kind of AKA Facebook model, are somehow separate and certainly not, let's see, thank you, certainly not equal in their digital communications, has really permeated the development of certain digital structures globally. And so now when we think about the internet, and from the perspective of those living outside in kind of global centers of power beyond something like a Cape Town or Nairobi, you almost have these two contemporary models of the African internet. The one is your Elon Musk going to Mars, and the other was a case from 2006 that I found so fascinating, where basically, if you remember Free Basics, I'm not sure how many of you would have been familiar with that, but there was a moment when Silicon Valley tech giants decided that Africans should get online. The best way to do that, after a few failed balloons and other tech interventions, was to zero-rate Wikipedia and Facebook and a few other digital platforms. And horror of horrors, Africans started innovating. So there were all these articles in Silicon Valley basically saying that Angolans had hacked the internet by creating closed Facebook groups and embedding the links to them in Portuguese language Wikipedia. And those Facebook groups were sharing large volumes of the material that dominates the internet. Now you guys can imagine what that material was, but it certainly wasn't your kind of average, encyclopedias. It was more of this sort of adult entertainment variety. And this caused this like massive scandal in Silicon Valley, because it was like, Angolan hackers have destroyed our desire to create the internet for everybody. And for me, what that revealed was the imagination that people in the continent of Africa weren't imagined to be capable of editing Wikipedia to begin with. And that there was a sense that you must be the passive recipients of tools, be grateful to have the opportunity to create a social network on our Facebook account, but heaven forbid that you use it to share movies or to share other kinds of content, or then to be able to actually interact with one another outside of our desired script. And for me, that seems very important. Okay, the slides are moving on their own, but it's fine. Oh no, come back. There we go, okay. But the question for me here to an audience like this is, well, who actually runs the African internet? Who makes this kind of thing possible? And maybe it was different in 2012, but certainly now, the people in this room have enormous power when it comes to determining the digital limits, the digital expansion, what are the permissible geopolitics? What are the ways in which our legal structures, our policies, the ways in which we manage data flows and data capabilities for our users? How do we ensure equitable systems and systems that actually work for people on the ground? And the people in this room it's probably one of the biggest gatherings of people who can actually make those decisions on the continent and in the world, and arguably in the world in a very real sense, because most of you have some concrete experience of how end users actually interact with the internet. And so part of this talk is a real call to take that responsibility very seriously. So I'll give you an example of why this matters. So I had to give a talk. The way universities work is when you apply for a job, they call you to give a lecture. And I used a similar slide, well, the same slide really, to the one that I showed you with the inverted map a few minutes ago. And you can imagine my horror when 5 minutes before the presentation, the administrator said to me, please, can you upload your slides onto the Google Drive as a backup? Yeah, of course, I quickly do that. And Google then took it upon itself to invert my map to the way that Google felt Africa should look. So if you can see that image there, it's slightly cut out, but you see Africa now in the center of the world where Africa is supposed to be. Europe and North America are now on top, and that red dot represents where Cape Town was originally in my slide. But without my permission, without any check, Google's algorithm had looked at the content on my slide, and I understand it doesn't see, but you know what I mean, and had inverted the knowledge that I was trying to share to conform with a Euro-American algorithmically inscribed view of the world. Now that's potentially okay, but also quite problematic, because it basically says that the way that Google Drive's algorithm sees Africa is the way that all of us have to operate in terms of digital futures. And I thought that that was really interesting. So I want to speak about these three critical concepts. I mean, the one is surveillance capitalism. And I'm by no means saying everybody must become a radical communist and give up free will and all of that. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I do think it's really interesting to look at how digital realities are making political and social alternatives quite difficult to think about. So a lot of surveillance capitalism is based on online shopping and on the idea that if we understand your shopping habits well enough, we can give you the right kind of nudges and prompts. But of course, that technology plays into things like who are you going to vote for? It plays into things like where might you want your children to go to school? What kind of behavior might you demonstrate that determines your risk profile for insurance or determines who might be able to get certain kinds of healthcare or not? And this work, I think, is very important for how we think about what kinds of surveillance do we want in our companies, in our systems, in our families, in our homes, and how do we learn to ask the right questions of technology to ensure that our data is being used in ways that we are comfortable with. Now, South Africa is kind of following the European Union's lead on this topic in terms of legislation, but I want to remind you all of how critical this is, not only for those in this room, but for those who are coming online for the first time, or are starting to do things like online shopping, and in some ways political engagement, social engagement, educational engagement. Because if every single moment of a child's learning journey is tracked by an algorithm, the algorithm may well then say, well, this kid has the potential to make it, and this other kid doesn't. And that could be useful for certain interventions, but it might have consequences that we don't yet know and haven't thought about. And my only ask is for the people building the systems to do a little bit of reflection around how, what kind of ethical frameworks need to be in space for this to work to the benefit of the people who are receiving it, particularly people who might not have the same digital capabilities as many of us. And I mean, my parents are quite well educated, but they tried to sell their car on Gumtree not too long ago and lost the car. And it was really interesting for me that if two people with master's degrees could so easily be scammed, what are the implications for those who haven't had the same opportunities of education? The second thing is this idea of digital colonialism. So this book actually starts with a story of Chief Lobangule from Zimbabwe, who was very anxious about the arrival of British telegraph poles. Now, the whole British Empire wouldn't be possible without the Victorian-era telegraph communication structure. And the chief was right to be concerned, because as soon as you had the structure in place, certain kinds of decisions could be made in the abstract without any sense of personal communication. And the book argues that with in the absence of appropriate policy and legislation, there's a real opportunity for a different kind of digital colonialism. So you've all heard data is the new oil. But whose data is the new oil, and who is making money off it? And to some extent, I'd imagine that many of your companies make money off it, and that's great. But what are the ways in which these systems also plug into bigger companies like your global giants? And how do we think about the fact that companies like Meta and Alphabet are now increasingly owning the digital infrastructure that runs the continent? And who profits off that? And it's not necessarily a terrible thing. I mean, some people made lots of money in colonialism as well. And some people, there were things that were arguably very useful in terms of infrastructure and so on that came from the development of spaces, of cities and all of that. But the cost was tremendous, and very, very, very few people, maybe Helen Ziller on a bad day on Twitter, might say something to the justification of these colonial structures. But basically, whether you call it colonialism or something else, the point is the inequality. And the point is that most of us sign digital products, terms, and conditions with no understanding of what they mean and no understanding of what actually happens to our data. Is it colonialism or not? We can debate it, but I think it's worth thinking about that in relation to the third point, which is Joy Buolamwini's notion of the coded gaze. And Joy is a researcher based at MIT. I think her parents are from Uganda, if I'm not mistaken, but I can double check that. So she's a second-generation immigrant to the United States. And what she found is that she was doing a project as an undergrad looking at facial recognition software. And in that project, she realized that the system couldn't track her face, but if she put on a white mask, the system recognized her face immediately. And she spent the last 5 to 10 years really working on, she's got something called the Algorithmic Justice League, which says, how do you acknowledge the coded gaze and the ways in which computer systems are trained on particular types of data sets to see particular things? And how do you then unpack the social and political implications of that, particularly for communities of color in the United States, which of course applies to most of the African continent? How do you think about the kinds of decisions that get made through the surveillance of cities, surveillance of education systems, surveillance of structures? And for me, this is something of tremendous urgency in South Africa because all three of these systems play out. Now, this was me coming to the hotel yesterday. So I live in Muizenberg, and some of you who know Cape Town will immediately see what's wrong with this map. So a few weeks ago, I think it was the end of last year, there was a really tragic moment when Cape Town had a whole bunch of taxi-related strikes. The city was on edge, and a medical doctor visiting from, I think, England was routed by Google Maps through a low-income area where there was quite a lot of frustration and anger being vented, and this medical doctor was tragically killed. And that in itself was a terrible, terrible tragedy. The result has been interesting. So it wasn't the first time, and a decision was made between Google and the South African government, some of you may even have been involved in this, to ensure that Maps no longer routes anybody through townships. So if I want to get from Muizenberg to this hotel, the easiest route for me from Muizenberg is actually along the R310, which is the coastal road. You might be able to see it on the slide. And if I take the R310, it takes me 25 minutes to get here. Whereas if I take the route that has now been put onto Google Maps, it takes an hour and 10 minutes. Now, that's inconvenient in terms of the extra time. But more importantly, it means that I never see how more than half of Cape Town live. Because if I only drive through the wealthy areas of Cape Town, I see one version of the country and one version of the planet. And that's something that has huge implications for how I live my life, for how people in Kailicha, who are basically rendered invisible by this tiny decision, live their lives. Who is included in the digital domain and who isn't? So this, for me, is when the coded gaze and surveillance capitalism come together. And on one level, there are real reasons for it. But what I find interesting is we don't have an opt-out option. So I get it that you need to be careful with tourists. And I check, there's a WhatsApp group that says, is there anything going on Baden-Powell Drive? And I can check that WhatsApp group, and if there is something happening, because for very good structural reasons, people who live in Khayelitsha have every right to be angry with the state, and sometimes do protest in certain ways. But I don't have the option of saying to Google, take me in a way that helps me see the full reality. Instead, it opts me out and takes me on this different route. And I think that it's an example of how we capture the urgency of the work that all of us are doing. How do we ensure that people are aware of the choices that are being made by algorithms that shape their vision and literally shape the version of a country or a geopolitical system or the world that we might see? Okay, so for me, South Africa is the best place to think about some of this stuff, because like with so many systems, South Africa is where the best and the worst of capitalism come together. I remember being in San Diego in the United States, walking across the border into Mexico, and feeling like, wow, this is very similar to going from a wealthy area in Cape Town into a low-income township space. There's something here very important about how global systems around income distribution and inequality coalesce in Cape Town in particular in powerful ways. So where Europe has the Mediterranean and then all the poor people, North America has the border with Mexico and then all the poor people. Australasia has the Pacific Islands. Almost every system in the world has a group of people over-consuming and a group of people under-consuming. And that is what is required for us to live in a way that enables the lifestyle that many of us in this room are accustomed to. So there's an exercise I get my students to do called the Global Footprint Calculator. And you can calculate how, if everybody lived the way you live, how many planets would you need? And I teach students who are quite young and some students who are a bit more established. I've never yet had a student who doesn't need 5 planets to be able to sustain their lives, who doesn't need everybody to live with 5 planets to be able to sustain the flights, the shopping, the electricity at home. You know, we can make Eskom jokes, but the point stands. Because the reality is that most of us who benefit from contemporary structures do consume more than we have at a planetary level. And part of what the challenge is that we all face is, how do we imagine alternative futures? Who sacrifices what in this era of climate collapse? And of course, the digital is going to play an outsized role in shaping what imaginations become possible. It's almost as if after the Cold War, people forgot that there could be alternatives, that there could be political and social realities outside of the dominant structures that might enable certain kinds of distribution so that we weren't in this extreme situation of inequality. But what do we do about it? You know, and for me, you guys are the people who really are at the coalface of doing this work every day. Because it is through the digital, increasingly, that most of our decisions are made, that most of our, social circles are mediated, that most of our political decisions are experienced and evoked. How do we shape the future? The people building the internet are the people who have the power to do that. Because each of the connections that we switch on or do not switch on, plug in, interact with in terms of intercompany agreements, all of those have implications for how the internet flows or functions online. And what kind of digital environment do we actually want in the continent, in the country, in our cities, in our homes, and of course in the world? I'm nearly done. And for me, the responsibility for protecting Africa's digital resources and the long-term capabilities lies with you. And that's why this was such an exciting opportunity as a kind of speaking event. I really feel that we've, as a society, said, well, the tech people are the magicians. They run this beautiful internet that we have. But that also comes with tremendous responsibility. It's almost like being the priests in the Middle Ages who could speak and read Latin and who would translate Latin to those who didn't have access to the Bible. Now, in a very different context, those of you who run the internet are the people who effectively bring knowledge and shape knowledge to end users. And for me, that is a tremendous opportunity, but it comes with a responsibility that is perhaps not taught in your average coding boot camp. I'm hoping that you can use this gathering as a chance to ask these kinds of questions, which often do get left out. You know, if we do this, then so what? How do we ensure that people who are working with our products understand? How can we think further than the imaginative limits that we have in front of us? So this is where the cables come up to land in Sangano, just south of Luanda in Angola. So this is a cable landing station on the coast of Africa. And there are so many places like this. If you have the right tools, you can open it up if you know where it is and just kind of basically walk in. And there's something so powerful about the internet coming to land in Sangano in a little village that doesn't have electricity. And so every day, trucks from the national petrol company come and bring the fuel that will power the generators of the internet landing station in Angola. And next door, there's a school where kids are learning without any kind of benefits of modern technology in certain ways. And it's a beautiful example of the kind of disconnect of digital infrastructure. The only thing that the station really does with the community is provide a space for people to charge their cell phones. And that's something important. I mean, the company is great and they do work very closely with the community. I think Angola Cables is doing fantastic work. But it's so powerful, this disconnect of those who are online and those who simply don't have a light switch to be able to turn on. So, my final slide is Steve Biko. Some of you might recognize him as a political activist, really important in terms of founding Black consciousness as a political movement in the apartheid era. And Biko had this beautiful line in his book, I Write What I Like, where he says, "The great powers of the world may have done wonders in giving the world an industrial and military look, but the great gift still has to come from Africa, giving the world a more human face." And as we look at the conversations around digital surveillance, around human rights, around bullying and harassment for teenagers, around body image, around all the different good things and bad things that come with the internet, I think there's a real opportunity for us here to say, okay, what do we want? How do we hold it? What structures do we have to create to make sure that the internet that we experience in this environment is something that allows people more humanity rather than less humanity, that allows us to be whole, that allows us to have a kind of freedom of imagination and freedom of humanity that might be of real value to the world. So thank you all so much for the work you do and for the opportunity to be here, and please feel free to reach out with questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. That was amazing. I certainly liked it. Layer 8 is a really important space, and it's a really good exposition. So in theory, we've got 1 minute for questions, but we're running late anyway, so let's just ignore that and take some questions. And if you can come to the microphone, if you can give your name and your affiliation, please. And
hello. Hi. My name's Alan Levine. I'm wearing my Internet Society hat for this question. Wow, that's fantastic. You have many degrees and you're sharing this unbelievable knowledge with us. And I just wanted to ask you if you can be cautious, because we're a bunch of network engineers. We're struggling to get new people with university degrees to get into networking. Many of the infrastructure providers in South Africa have people with no degrees at all on their entire executive team. So you're posing questions for people that are thinking at a high level to necessarily what we've got right now. And if I can just say to you, can you go back to university and try and encourage the computer scientists to learn more about networking, because they actually think it's all about apps and all those other companies that you're talking about, and that's where they want to go work, rather than coming to us and helping us build all this infrastructure.
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's a really important one. And part of what I think the opportunity is to highlight how important this work is, whilst also addressing the fact that when I think of the computer the computer science people who I knew from undergrad, most of them are now working in London and in San Francisco. And that is an aspect of digital colonialism that is also really important to think about, not just for the network engineers, but also for the lawyers and for the policy people and for the people who are kind of able to think at that kind of high-level global structure. Most African governments can't pay them. And it's one thing in South Africa, but it's another thing in Zambia or Angola or Ivory Coast. It's very difficult to retain talent when the global industry takes out as quickly as it can most of the top brains in the industry. And so there is something about messaging there, and I mean, I'm working a bit with computer science at UCT, but part of this for me is, what are the stories we all tell about the work we do? And maybe it's a challenge to the conference to say, well, okay, if you need to recruit, how do you make this something that is really exciting, where young people feel that responsibility and that joy and that ability to contribute? Because I really think the new generation are keen for kind of meaning, and impact. You don't, okay, well, maybe I see different students, but I think it's an important conversation to have, so thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, cool. Jess is here all day, and thank you again. I'm going to close it here.
Thanks very much.
Right. Next up, we've got Ed DeLange, who's going to give us a quick intro as to how to get the best out of a ZANOG meeting. Over to you, Ed.
My slides, yes, no. Okay, well, starting on the second slide, that's fine. Hi, everyone. I'm Ed DeLange. In the interest of times, I'm going to work slightly quicker through this than initially planned, but yeah. So welcome to ZANOG. We seem to have had quite a nice turnout. There's been 220 odd check-ins so far this morning, so there's some more to come. And just out of interest, or interesting point, when I looked at the registration list, there's actually quite a few students who registered here, so yeah, but we'll get to that now. So the first thing, what's in this conference for us? Why are we all here? When we did the collaborative editing of this slide, I asked the person who added the slide, and it's like, what is this acronym? He's like, no, it's for the millennials. They'll know what it is. And technically, I'm a millennial, and I was like, nope, no clue. So that's what's in it for me. So our industry is a bit of a weird one. If we were in the traditional sort of brick and mortar bakery business, if we had two bakeries on the same street and one bakery burnt down, if the other bakery was a capitalist bakery, well, he'd be rejoicing because he'd be getting more money and more business, where our industry is a bit different. If an ISP falls off the face of the internet, while, yeah, you might be able to scoop up a customer, but if your customers can't reach that other ISP's customers, e.g. a web page they might be hosting or some email service, your customer's going to come and complain to you, not to the people who burnt down, but they're going to moan to you that they can't access X, Y, and Z. Like, good case in point is when Facebook goes down and, the internet's broken. So, yeah, so these conferences for us really is a place to collaborate technically, but compete commercially. So let's use this week to learn something new, collaborate, a group collaboration of learning, and grow. So the older people here would remember when the mailing lists were our only way to get new information, and Google has now really broken the social contract between network operators because, well, instant messaging and instant feedback is the, whoops, slide's not working. Instant feedback is the thing. I mean, like, ZANOG has a Telegram group with a couple of hundred people on it, and people want to rather get the instant feedback from something like that rather than the old school, let's do a mail, get it archived, so if someone wanted to ask that same question later on, they could go look it up. So the information is very, well, short-lived almost, because these things aren't able to be archived. And because of that, we're sort of losing our collective conscious we had. So these events are, again, helping to try and grow this. So we've already had one question at the microphone. So I think the only person in this room who probably knows everything is probably Frank. I don't know where Frank is sitting, but for everyone else, please come up to the microphones, ask questions. When you get to the microphone, please state where you're from. If you're not representing your company, you can do like many of us would probably do and say like we're from the internet. But please say who you are. Remember, this is being recorded, and you might not always have your face on the recording at that point, so make it clear who you are. And please ask questions. As the quote goes, he who does ask a question is a fool for a minute, but he who does not is a fool for life. So yeah, the microphones are over, there's one in each aisle, and there's a floating microphone somewhere around, but please line up orderly for the questions. Sorry. Lunches. You might have noticed on the program that our lunches are long. And this is by design. Because ultimately, as we said earlier, this conference is here for networking. So please don't go sit down with your co-worker that you sit next to every day, or go to the pub with and have a beer every week. Go sit with someone new, meet some new people, and try find a new person to build a communality with, to network and hopefully do more business with. Because a lot of the business we can do here really can grow our companies, because there's lots of overlaps where we don't necessarily need to compete, but we can help each other grow in certain areas by infrastructure sharing, which is one of the reasons why ZANOG, well, KZANOG back then started in Durban. So this year we've got the first meeting tool we've had for an event. It's been happening at other events, but we've got our own one now. If you opted in for it while you registered, you would have gotten an email somewhere last week saying, hey, this is the meeting tool, the thing you can go log into and say, I want to have a meeting with Fergus, see what time slots he's got available. Fergus can say, yes, let's meet then, or no, let's find another slot. So please, if you haven't yet logged into it, please go log into it. The room is where these meetings are happening. There's 20 tables, is in the sort of the reception foyer area. There's the middle room. It's called Breakaway 2, I think, or the bilateral meeting. And please always sit at your table. Don't try and steal someone else's table, because this might have a bit of a knock-on effect. If everyone starts using other tables, it might just get a mess. And please remember, other people might have the table slot after you. They're 20-minute slots, so yeah, when I last checked, there were quite a few meetings already booked. So please join in, book some more. If you need to have a contact with someone that you can't quite recognize, you've only dealt with on email, you want to meet them face-to-face, both people know, go to table 20 at 11 a.m., and it's a super easy way to meet each other. So yeah, if you haven't signed up, you can go to the reception, you can hunt me down, or probably hunt Donald down, the two bearded people from ZANOG, and we'll be able to help you to quickly sign up for that tool. Unfortunately, you can't just make it a self-sign-up because of weird regulation rules and not having people's personal information shared, so it needs to be a bit of a manual process, unfortunately. But this is only if you had not ticked the box when we signed up originally. So, peering personals had been done at iWeek now for 10 years. I think the first ones were done in 2014, before my time. So yeah, these were two of the peering personals that were done in the beginning, PCH and POSIX systems. They've come a long way. Networks are different now, so yeah. And we'll also allow data centers who have a peering solution to also submit slides to, well, get people to come and peer in their facilities. If you want to submit your peering personals, that is roughly the template that you can use. And please just send it in email to prezo@nog.net.za, and we will add it into the next presentation slot. And it's basically a first come, first serve thing. You'll see in the program there's a couple of peering personal slots. There are some socials, again, more networking. The first one today is from 1800 in the courtyard next door. They'll do it up a bit. There'll be appropriate libations and snacks. The first one, I think, is sponsored by Africa Data Centers. And then tomorrow's one is a Beers for Peers, sponsored by NAP Africa and Terrico. And that will be at a place called Fancy Frank's in Somerset West. They will have buses that will start doing the circle loop from here to to the venue and then drop people back off here again at 10 o'clock. If you stay later, you'll need to make your own plan, but they will announce what the last bus is. So please do join in on both of these events. They are generally lots of fun and, well, not maybe so good for the bubble-us, but good fun to be at. As I mentioned earlier, there's been quite a few students that have registered for this event, which I'm quite excited by because it helps with issues like Alan brought up. For these students, please remember these are potential future employers for you. So put your best foot forward, ask questions is the easy way for people to sort of notice you and realize, well, you can be interacted with. And then later on in the day, we'll also do an update for the actual ZANOG update where we'll speak about potential volunteering options. So that'll also be a good way to get your name out into the industry. And that's that, yeah. Thank you everyone, have fun at the event. Please, we're gonna try and keep everything on time. We're sorry for the delay this morning and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. Mark is up next. He's going to talk about DWM and optical networking in 2024, what to expect. He must have spoken here before in the past. If not, he's spoken lots of other places, and I'm pretty sure we all know who he is. Mark Tinker. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Tinker. I'm used to be with CCOM, as many of you would know, but now I'm with a new company called Transmission Co that I'm managing. And I'm just going to try and talk to you about, if the slides do come up, transmission services and transmission networks. Being historically an IP guy, I've now moved over to the dark side so I can make some real money. But yeah, so I'm just trying to find a way to simplify transmission services and transmission networks. And it's great to see that there's a lot of transmission and optical presentations at this meeting this year. So I think throughout the course of this week, there will be quite a lot to understand from that. So it's just a bit of an outlook through to 2024 as to what to expect. A lot of these technologies might not come into South Africa this year, but it's very forward-looking, and we expect to see them at some point. We expect to see the slides at some point, too. There we go. Whoops. All right. Okay. So first things first, it's safe to say that I'll try and catch us up so we're on time. It's safe to say that supply chain issues are mostly resolved in the semiconductor space, which means that deliveries, manufacture lead times, and all that should be resolved. Obviously, ongoing conflicts in Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Palestine, and obviously, as we all know, the Red Sea with the cables that were cut, I think, a week and a half ago, is also some potential to be concerned about. But by and large, we estimate a 1% growth in the sector this year, which is a bit of a slowdown for telecoms. On the 400G side, 2023 was about a lot of 400G, mostly for the content providers. 2024 will be a lot of that for the telco. Telco has had a bit of a slow start, mainly because they want things like 0 dB power, better monitoring, that sort of thing. But we should see a lot of uptake for 400G services, not necessarily in Africa this year, but across the board for telcos, a little bit in Africa as well. Africa will mostly be the content providers, and the majority of the form factor will still be OSFP and QSFP-DD, just because they're nice and small. There's loads of other form factors, but those tend to be quite bulky, and I don't think we'll see a lot of them in operation. The interesting one that has almost everybody up in arms is the expansion of the wavelengths from C to L, and obviously a combination of C and L. I think with the exception of Japan, most of the world still runs on C-band. And due to the improvements in coherent detection technology, as well as high order modulation, for example, we've pretty much gotten to the limits of C-band. So one of the ways that we're going to see improvements in that for spectrum efficiency for this year and next year is some vendors and some operators starting to combine C and L band to increase capacity. In extended C and extended L, we expect to double that to 9.6 terahertz, which would give us, give or take, between 50 to 80 terabits of fiber capacity. Later on, at some point, we expect to move into the Super C and the Super L. The combination of both of those would, in theory, give us 12.2 terahertz, 6.1 each in each band. And that would essentially get us to about 100 terabits of fiber capacity, depending on distance. It's all still very experimental. It's all still under development, but this is where we're going, because this is where we can expect to gain spectral efficiency before you need to add fiber and all sorts of things. There's still a number of challenges with C and L. Cost is a major one. Stimulated Raman scattering is another, which is where you can essentially amplify C band into L band and cause a tilt. There's mechanisms to compensate against that, so all of that is still either under development or still being shipped by a few vendors. So you won't see it across many operators, but that's where it has to go if operators are under stress. I think India is a good place for that. C and L in subsea is also being discussed, but there's more challenges in subsea because, as you know, subsea has a problem of power. Physical infrastructure, so the fiber itself, SDM, spatial division multiplexing, is where we expect to see more improvements in gaining more capacity when we run out of spectral efficiency options. Obviously, option A is a standard single mode fiber, where you've got multiple fiber pairs in a cable. And to get that through, especially for subsea, you have to sort of thin out the cladding, which would obviously introduce risk. Option B, which is the multi-core uncoupled fiber, is where you've got multiple cores inside a single fiber glass, and then each core guides its own wave. Uncoupled means that they are slightly pushed apart. Option C, which is few mode fiber, sort of sits in between multi-mode fiber, 850 nanometer style, and single mode fiber. So multi-mode is easily about 25 to 30 modes. Single mode is just one mode. Few mode is sort of in between, so anywhere from 5 to 10 modes. And in that one, you're actually guiding an actual mode through a fiber core. D is coupled multi-core fiber, which is sort of like B, but the fiber cores are packed together, just to give you more density in the fiber. And then the last one, which is very sci-fi, is essentially a honeycomb with a hole in the middle. It's basically sending light through air. And it should, in theory, be the fastest fiber, because in a vacuum, air is faster than glass. But what we found with that fiber at the moment, with the few that have deployed it, is that it has a slightly higher loss than normal, about 1 dB versus standard 0.25 dB. It's still being deployed to some degree, but it's not yet anywhere near commercial use. The three I've sort of highlighted over there, uncoupled, few mode fiber, uncoupled, is essentially what they look like once the assistant disappears. So the uncoupled multi-core fiber is essentially similar to fiber that we run today, so you don't need special DSPs. You can run them into the same chassis that you have today. Few mode fiber obviously requires DSPs to compensate for crosstalk of the different modes, as does coupled core multi-core fiber. So all these are what we call novel fiber solutions. For the most part, we expect option A to be the more popular one for the time being, especially on the subsea side. Standardization and integration. So like the IETF in IP, the optical folk have got Open ROADM. They've also got something known as OIF, Optical Interoperability Forum, as well as OpenZR+. It's essentially supposed to mimic having Arista on one end and Juniper on the other and being happy. The reality, though, in optical networking is that that kind of integration doesn't work really well in real life. Where they have actually done useful work is to standardize on optical pluggables, right? So you can buy a ZR Plus optic from Adtran, you can get a ZR Plus optic from Flex Optics, and that should work, and that's fantastic. And they're doing the same with 800G and 1.6 tera. But to actually have a line system from one vendor, a core from another vendor, an edge from another vendor, and have all that together with the standardized NMS is science fiction to me. I have hope, but we shall see. But this is, so Open Rodem will still keep on taking on new members. So if you want to sign up, feel free. 800G pluggables should be starting to ship now. So you should start to see equipment vendors, especially on the router side, switch side, start pushing out equipment that has 800G ports native. Form factor is still quite similar to QSFP, DD, and OSFP, so it's backwards compatible. What's great about 800G also is that it can demultiplex down to 400G, 100G, and so forth. So that should be mostly in 2025, but should start shipping now based on a 5 nanometer DSP. On the super channel wavelength side for the optical infrastructure, this is what we now call the terabit era. Pretty much every vendor now has got anywhere from 1.2 to 1.6 single channel optical carriers. Cisco just announced with their company called, formerly Acacia, NTT Electronics, Nokia, and Infinera. Ciena did theirs on 1.6 at 3 nanometer, but the one that was most interesting was Huawei. Huawei did theirs are trying to do theirs with semiconductors made by their own SMIC manufacturing company in China, because they are still banned technically from taking semiconductors from the rest. So that's interesting. But essentially you're looking at those DSPs will essentially support anywhere from 1 tera down to 800G, down to 400G at different distances. So at short distances, you get a lot of capacity. At longer distances, they come in really handy as well. So we should start to see the channel count go up, 400G, 600G, that sort of thing. Single lane pluggables for 100G, especially in the data center. So for servers, moving away from 25G, bypassing 40G, going straight to 100G, single lane. The majority of us still buy LR4s, which is 25G lanes. But I think now we started to see DR and FR pluggables shipping last year. I think that's going to ramp up this year. I think a lot of exchange points, for example, in Europe are now starting to push a lot more of the single lane 100G. I think we might start to see that in South Africa as well. So I think there's a bit of money to be saved by going with single lane 100G, especially if you run optical-based servers in the data center. But also between cross-connects, customers, providers, that sort of thing. So this will also pick up in 24. Another one that's sort of sci-fi, but also on the way, is to simplify power management and cost for optics with this one called the linear drive pluggable optics, or LPO. So essentially what this is doing is it's taking the DSP, digital signal processor, out of the standard optic and then moving all that functionality into the switching ASIC on the device. So in your router, in your switch, in your WDM infrastructure. As you can see in the bottom picture, the DSP is taken out and all that is simplified. So you reduce cost by about 40% because the majority of the cost is the DSP, and you reduce power down to about 50%. So you can take a 400G 13-watt pluggable down to, let's say, 5 watts type thing. And that's going to be a great thing if you have tons of them in a device that's heating up very quickly. And then I think Prof. Jess spoke about this before as well. Semiconductor sovereignty. I think the Chinese have realized they need to go out on their own, and we know, leave it to the Chinese to do something and do it big. So the big four, China, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, are still going to lead, but you do have a lot of investment going into Europe, especially around semiconductors for things like driverless cars and stuff like that. There's going to be a lot of awards that governments are giving out this year for countries, universities, governments, and so forth, and private manufacturers to go out and start to localize, remove dependence away from TSMC, from Broadcom, NVIDIA, and those few companies that actually are huge at making semiconductors. So there's a bit of a semiconductor war, I think, over the next 5 to 7 years. And just based on the numbers for market cap growth last year, at about 72% in just 1 year, you can see a lot of investment going into semiconductor sovereignty. This is going to be a big one. And to be honest, I think China is going to come out winning at the end. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. We're really running late, so he's here all week if you've got questions, unless someone has a really quick one off. No. And Ed, could you give Mark? Oh. And Ben has a quick question. Can you try the mic because it's broadcast?
It's on now. Yeah. Ben, Work Online. For the benefit of mostly the rest of the audience, I think that probably a lot of people don't know what an optical mode is. Maybe quick explanation of that.
An optical mode.
As in multi-mode, single mode.
Oh, okay. In multi-mode, for example, 850 nanometer, you've got, how do I say this? You've got multiple, let's say multiple carriers inside the fiber cladding to overlay and relay the signal from the electrical side, optical side, back to electrical between two devices. And those multiple modes then allow you to get the amount of capacity and bandwidth required between both. In the single mode, you've only got one specific mode inside the core itself that is responsible for carrying the wavelength and the traffic. Now, in few mode fiber, which is a combination of, which is sort of sitting in the middle of multi-mode and single mode, you've got still multiple modes through the same fiber core, but not at the level of multi-mode. So about 5 to 10 versus 20 to 25, and that's essentially to help reduce the amount of crosstalk between the actual modes itself. It's a rather complex way to move light through a fiber, which is why the requirement for the DSP on the equipment and the end to sort of compensate for that is mandatory. But yeah, I don't really think it's going to take off so much, but I think for short distances, it might. A couple of kilometers maybe medium haul, I think it might do. But I think uncoupled multi-core fiber is likely to be more interesting.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. Thanks again. So next up, we have peering personals. Donald, are you running peering personals? Yep. So anybody who wants to do a peering personal, please head over to the AV desk and you'll get called on stage. And if you can go off that on the other side of the stage, we can have a flow of people running. So, do we have peering personal volunteers?
Switch on. Can we have Adept, ZANOG, TIX, and DPA? Is Adept here?
Hi, so we're an ISP. We've been around for ages. We've got an open peering policy. There was a QR code on my slide you can scan, but otherwise, if you want to talk, hit me up or send a mail to peering@adept.co.za. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Donald Jolly, and ZANOG has an AS328365. We have CDNs embedded in the network, as well as services and tools that the community can use. So we have an open peering policy. However, we require bilaterals, which means that you have to have a peering DB entry, because we use peering DB to build our BGP sessions. So that's the only real thing you need to do. But what's important about these peering personals is that you see the person up here, now you know who to come speak to, in terms of peering with that network. So email or come see me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Frank, not the one Ed mentioned earlier. I'm living in Tanzania, and we are having internet exchanges of various efficiency. The biggest one is in Dar es Salaam, but also in 5 other cities in Tanzania, several peers. If you're interested, come talk to me, anything in Tanzania.
Good morning. My name is Eckert from Digital Parks Africa. We have a data center in the heart of Gauteng, right between Johannesburg and Pretoria. Probably in the space in Gauteng that's got the most dense data center population in radius of about 5 kilometers. We started late last year with the Jinx node, so we are still getting going, still new. But yeah, it's all about building resilience into networks, and we welcome everybody to come and talk to us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. We're now. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for speaking this morning. Thank you for the peering personals. We're now going to have a coffee break, and we're back at 11:30. Yep. So if you could all be back in for then, so we can try and start on time. Coffee's up the corridor, and keep going. And look forward to seeing you all back then. Thank you.